Hey there, I'm Becca Scott, and I'm going to teach you how to play Warhammer Underworld's Beastgrave. Warhammer Underworld's Beastgrave is a fast-paced game of savage combat in the heart of a hungering mountain, fought between war bands of fighters seeking treasure, or just trying to survive. It's pretty neat. To win a game of Warhammer Underworlds, you need to score more glory points than your opponent. You earn points by slaying enemy fighters and completing special objectives. You'll need to learn your warband's strengths, master their tactics, and build killer decks to secure victory. To play, all you need are a couple of game boards, some special dice, 2 decks of cards each, and of course your warband. You can find all of these in the Warhammer Underworld's Beastgrave core set. Oh, and you'll also need an opponent. In Warhammer Underworld's Beastgrave, you'll be able to choose from a range of warbands to battle for victory. We've got 2 to pick from in the core set: the Savage Beastmen of Grashrax Despoilers and the Vengeful Spirit Warriors of Scaith's Wild Hunt. Each warband is made up of a handful of models. These are your fighters. The fighters in each warband are always the same, which just means that every Grashrax Despoilers warband, for example, uses the same 6 miniatures. You'll find rules for your models on the fighter cards, which tell you the characteristics of that fighter, what attack actions they can take, and how they become inspired. More on that in a minute. Every warband has a leader, marked with the crown symbol next to their name on their fighter card. In Warhammer Underworld's Beastgrave, each player uses 2 special decks of cards as they play: a power deck and an objective deck. These decks are just as important as your warband. You'll be able to play straight out of the core set with pre-made decks of cards, which have everything you need to get started. Many Warhammer Underworld's players enjoy customizing their decks to make powerful combinations, combining the skill of deck building with high-level miniatures wargaming tactics. For our demo here, though, we'll use the ones in the starter set. Just make sure to give them a shuffle first. How you win in Beastgrave depends on your objective deck. Made up of 12 unique objective cards, you can score glory by achieving conditions on each card. Some cards might ask you to hold an objective, while others might have you taking out enemy fighters or performing a number of specific actions. When you match the conditions on the card, you show the opponent the card you've just scored, take the glory shown at the bottom of the card, then put the objective card in the discard pile next to your deck. Remember, whoever has the most glory points at the end of the game wins, so build your objective deck carefully. Your other deck is comprised of power cards. Made up of 20 or more unique cards, this power deck allows you to change the conditions in the game as you go along. For example, upgrades give your fighters a lingering boost, like this awesome dagger, while gambits allow you to play all sorts of sneaky tricks. The 2 types of gambits are spells, which let you use powerful magic to zap your foes, and ploys, which tend to be short-lived or instantaneous effects that can turn the tide of battle. Gambits can be used for free at various points during the game, usually the power step, while you have to spend a glory point to use an upgrade. Don't worry, you still get that glory point when deciding which player has won at the end of the game. Up to half your power deck can be gambits, the rest must be upgrades. We recommend playing with the pre-built decks for your first few games. Once you're feeling confident with the rules, you can start swapping in different cards from the core set, warband expansions, and card packs, and even building killer decks from scratch. So, your warband is chosen, and your objective and power decks are built and shuffled. Grab your opponent, because you're ready to play. Throughout this video, I'll refer to some of the keywords in Warhammer Underworlds. Keywords are new to this edition of Warhammer Underworlds to make keeping track of rules even easier. Some keywords refer to specific rules like scything, which allows you to make an attack action against multiple adjacent enemies, or ensnare, which allows you to ignore enemy dodge rolls when they defend. Others, like hunter and quarry, are labels that have no inherent effect but change the way you interact with certain fighters, upgrades, and gambits. You can find more information about each keyword and what they mean in your rulebook. The game of Warhammer Underworlds is played in this sequence. I'll talk you through it. First, you set up. Then you go through 3 rounds, each of which has an action phase and an end phase. After the 3 rounds, you work out who's won. Let's go over each part in a little bit more detail. First up, we set up the game. In this phase, we'll place our game boards, feature tokens, and lethal hexes, draw our starting hands, and place our fighters. In this step, the players roll off. In a roll-off, each player takes 4 attack or defense dice and rolls them. Whoever rolls more of these wins. If it's a tie, whoever rolls more of these wins. If it's still a tie, whoever rolls more of these wins. If it's then a tie, just roll the dice again until you get a winner. The player who wins decides which player picks a game board first. If you pick first, place a game board of your choice on the table with the side you want to use face up. Each board is double-sided and has a hex grid on each side. You'll find 2 of these in the core set. After the first board is placed, the other player picks their board and places it so the hex grids match up. They can place their board anywhere touching the first, as long as at least 3 hexes are completed by connecting the boards from long edge to long edge, or if 2 hexes are completed by connecting them short edge to short edge. You cannot set a short edge against a long edge though. And just like that, we've got a battlefield. As you can imagine, there's some real strategy behind how you place your boards, and you can pick up additional boards from the Warhammer Underworlds range to provide even more variety and tactical depth. Which board you pick will often depend on your opponent and how you want to play. Do you want an open field to battle over, or loads of lethal and blocked hexes to hide behind? It's up to you. Speaking of which, let's go over special hexes. These are blocked hexes. You can't put anything in these hexes, and fighters can't see or move through them, unless a card tells you otherwise. This here is a lethal hex. If a fighter enters one of these hexes, they'll take 1 point of damage. These are starting hexes. These show where you can set up your fighters during setup. All these are edge hexes. This just means they're on the edge of the battlefield, which is important for some rules. Finally, we've got incomplete hexes. These are not part of the battlefield. Models can't move through them or interact with them in any way. Just imagine they're not there. With our battlefield set up, it's time to place the tokens. First, we shuffle the feature tokens numbered 1 to 5 and place them number side down. Starting with the player who placed a board first, we take it in turns to put one on the board. Feature tokens can be placed anywhere that isn't a starting, blocked, lethal, or edge hex, or within 2 hexes of another feature token. Once we've placed all 5, we flip them over to reveal their numbered side. On this side, the feature tokens are called objectives, a key point on the battlefield that can be held for glory points if you have the appropriate objective card in hand. All you need to do to control an objective token is have one of your fighters stand on it. If it gets flipped over again by a gambit card or a fighter ability during the game, it turns into a lethal hex. After the feature tokens are placed, both players can place 1 additional lethal hex token, starting with the player who chose the first game board. You can put this in any empty hex other than a lethal hex, a starting hex, or a hex that contains a feature token. Next, we draw our starting hands. After shuffling the decks, we place them face down. 3 cards are drawn from the objective deck and 5 cards are drawn from the power deck. Make sure your opponent doesn't see these. You wouldn't want to give them a strategic advantage. Sometimes cards or effects will cause you to draw a card. To do this, just take the top card from the relevant deck. When you draw your starting hands, you can choose to discard 1 or both of them. After this, you can draw a new hand of cards for objectives, powers, or both. Be careful though, you won't get to use any cards you discard later in the game as they go into your discard pile. Once they're gone, they are gone. It's now time to deploy our fighters. At the beginning of this step, both players roll off as before, with the winner choosing who places a fighter first. Players then take it in turns to place a fighter from their warband onto the battlefield. Fighters can only be placed on starting hexes in their player's territory and can't be placed in a hex that already has a fighter in it. Once all the fighters have been placed, we're ready to start the battle. Before we go any further, let's remind ourselves of the game sequence. Every game of Warhammer Underworlds you play is broken into 3 rounds, each consisting of an action phase and an end phase. In the action phase, you'll take it in turns with your opponent to take 4 activations each. In the end phase, you'll score objectives, upgrade fighters, and discard and draw cards. The action phase is where you do battle. Fighters move into position or charge their foes. Heroic attacks are made, spells are slung, and players vie to score their objectives. In this phase, you've got 4 activations. You'll keep track of these with your activation tokens. At the start of each action phase, players roll off. In the first round, the player who finished setting up first gets to add a bonus critical success symbol to their roll. The winner then gets to choose who takes the first activation. After they've chosen, players take activations one after the other until each has taken 4. After this, we move on to the end phase. But just how do activations work? When it's your turn to take an activation, you'll pick one of your fighters to make an action, or you'll make a player action. Fighters have 4 actions to choose from: a move action, attack action, charge action, or a guard action. We'll look at each of these in order. Some fighters have different actions they can take, which will be on their fighter card or on an upgrade card you've given them. You can activate the same fighter more than once in a single action phase, and even make the same action with them more than once, so long as the rules don't say otherwise. When a fighter makes a move action, you simply move them across the battlefield up to a number of hexes equal to their move characteristic. They can't move through other fighters, even friendly fighters, or through blocked hexes unless their fighter card says otherwise. Some gambits or upgrades might also allow you to move through an occupied or blocked hex. Once a fighter has made a move action, you give them a move token. Just place it beside them. If a fighter has a move token, they can't make a move or charge action later on in the same action phase. Most fighters have at least one attack action on their fighter card, like Grashrak Fellhoof's Obsidian Blade. Some upgrade cards can also give you additional attack actions. Attack actions use attack dice, which look like this. Each attack action has a range characteristic, which tells you how far the attack can reach, a dice characteristic that tells you how many attack dice to roll and which symbol is a success for that roll, and a damage characteristic that tells you how much damage the attack action deals if it's successful. Attacking follows a simple sequence. First, you declare your attack action and designate a target. You can only choose one attack action on the attacker's fighter card or an upgrade the fighter has, and the target of the attack must be in range, a distance in hexes shown here. The target must also be visible to the attacking fighter. Next, you make an attack roll, rolling a number of attack dice equal to the action's dice characteristic. If the attack action is a spell, you'll roll magic dice instead. We'll see more about these shortly. After you've rolled your dice, you find out how many successes you've got. These are the symbols that match the symbol on the attack action you've chosen. This symbol is a critical success. These symbols can also be successes depending on supporting fighters. We'll look at how they work later on. However, your opponent then has a chance to defend themselves. To do this, they roll a number of dice equal to the target's defense characteristic and count the number of successes they get. That's how many symbols match the one on their defense characteristic. As before, this symbol is a critical success, and these symbols can be successes if there are any supporting fighters. With our attack roll and defense roll complete, we can determine if you've succeeded in the attack. If you've rolled more critical successes than your opponent, the attack action succeeds regardless of anything else that was rolled. If your opponent rolled more critical successes than you, the attack fails. If you've rolled the same number of critical successes, including if you both get 0, then you go on to compare your other successes. If you've rolled more successes than your opponent, the attack action succeeds. If you've rolled the same number of successes, or your opponent rolled more successes than you, the attack fails. If you've rolled the same number of successes as your opponent, and at least one success, you can drive the target back a hex away from your attacking fighter. If the attack succeeds, you then deal damage to the target equal to the damage characteristic of the attack action. Mark this by placing wound tokens on the enemy fighter card. If a fighter makes an attack action while any friendly fighters are adjacent to their target, those adjacent friendly fighters are said to be supporting the attack, and the attacker gets 1 support for each of those supporting fighters. Similarly, if a fighter is the target of an attack action and there are any friendly fighters adjacent to the attacker, those friendly fighters are supporting the target being attacked, so the target gets 1 support for each of those supporting fighters. So, what does the support do for you? Remember these symbols? If one of the fighters has just 1 more support than the other fighter, then this symbol also counts as a success in their attack or defense roll. If they have 2 or more support more than the other fighter, they can use this symbol too. Some attack actions have extra rules, like cleave or ensnare. Where this is the case, those rules will be explained on the card themselves or in the rulebook. Some attacks may also have the scything keyword. This means that when you attack, you get to take several attack actions in sequence against multiple adjacent enemies. Okay, so that's attack actions. Before we move on though, there's just one more thing. You don't give your fighter a token when they've made an attack action, so they can do it again and again if you keep activating them. Charging is a special kind of action known as a super action. This means you get to combine 2 actions into 1 activation. In the case of a charge, this allows you to make a move action followed by an attack action, letting you close the distance and smash your enemy all in one go. Nice. There's one downside. After you've completed the move part of the charge action, you get a charge token. Unless you're getting sneaky with certain cards, fighters with charge tokens cannot be activated again until the next round. When you activate a fighter, they can make an action to go on guard. Give them a guard token to show this. When a fighter who is on guard is the target of an attack action, they count both block and dodge symbols as successes in their defense rolls. In Beastgrave, fighters who are on guard cannot be driven back. Perfect if you're trying to hold a key objective. If a fighter on guard makes a charge action though, they are no longer on guard and they lose their guard token. Some fighters have actions on their fighter cards and some upgrades have actions on them as well. When you activate a fighter with one of these actions or upgrades, they can make one of these actions instead of one of the 4 normal actions. Just follow the text on the card. You can also spend your activations on one of 3 player actions. You can choose to draw a power card, discard an objective card and draw a new one, or you can opt to pass and do nothing with this activation. After each activation, whether you activated a fighter or took a player action, both players play the power step. We're still in the action phase here. This is just a step that happens after each player takes an activation. So there are 8 of these in each action phase. In the power step, the player who just had an activation can play a power card if they want to. If they don't, they say pass. Then the other player can play a power card if they want to. If they don't, they say pass. If both players say pass consecutively, that's the end of the power step and the next player takes their activation. Otherwise, the players take it in turns to play a power card or pass until both players pass one after the other. Let's take a look at the power cards. I already mentioned that there are 2 kinds of power cards, upgrades and gambits. Upgrades look like this. Note the neat cogs in the corner. As I said before, you need to spend a glory point to give a fighter an upgrade. As long as you've got a glory point to spend, when it's your turn to play a card in the power step, just reveal the upgrade, flip that glory to its spent side, and upgrade your fighter. Note that some upgrades are restricted to certain fighters. Where this is the case, there will be a restrictions box at the bottom of the card telling you which fighters can have it. Once a fighter has an upgrade, they have it for the rest of the game. Gambits come in 2 kinds, ploys and spells. Anyone can use ploys, but for spells, you'll need some wizards. Ploys have this symbol in the corner and are pretty easy to use. When it's your turn in the power step, you just reveal the ploy that you want to use, and whatever is written on that card happens. It might make the next attack action more dangerous, or let you push a fighter, or all sorts of other things. Whatever the effect, once it is resolved, the ploy goes into your discard pile. Some ploys have a little delay and will affect the next of a certain type of action, like an attack action. This sort of ploy lasts until that action, or the end of the next activation, whichever comes first. When this happens, that ploy goes into the discard pile. Some gambits say that they persist. This just means that instead of going into your discard pile at the end of the next activation, they stick around for as long as the card says they do, or until another card gets rid of them. Remember, once both players are done playing cards, the power step ends and it's the next player's activation. Play goes back and forth like this until both players have had 4 activations and the last power step has been played. Some fighter cards, upgrades, and gambits have reactions printed on them. Reactions are special actions that are taken out of sequence, usually during or after an activation, when the condition they describe is met. These actions don't cost an activation and don't involve activating a fighter, so even a fighter who has a charge token can make a reaction if the conditions are right. When a player wants to use a reaction, they just say so, and if the reaction is on a gambit in their hand, they reveal it. Or if it's a spell, they attempt to cast it in the same way they would in the power step. The reaction is resolved and then play resumes where it left off. If a player has 2 or more reactions that could be played at the same time, they can only choose to use one of them. Similarly, if 2 players want to use a reaction at the same time, only one of them can do so. The player whose activation comes next. In Warhammer Underworlds, fighters can become inspired, making them stronger, faster, or tougher, and sometimes all of these things. To make your fighters inspired, you need to meet certain conditions. Remember that gold box on the fighter card? This is what tells you a fighter's inspired condition. When that condition is met, the fighter becomes inspired. Flip their fighter card over to reveal its inspired side with improved characteristics and actions. Some cards have the word scatter on them, followed by a number with an instruction. These cards use the scatter token to choose a random direction or create a random path for an effect. You never know which way a crackling lightning bolt or an out-of-control fighter will go. To resolve scatter, you just put the scatter token on the board, lined up with the grid, then roll a number of attack dice equal to the number after scatter on the card. So if it says scatter 3, you would roll 3 dice. Then you build what's called a chain from the hex in which the scatter starts. Choose one of the dice you rolled and compare it to the scatter token. This shows which hex, adjacent to the origin hex, to place that die in. Then you place the next attack dice in the same way, in a hex adjacent to the previous dice in the chain. When you've used all of your dice, the chain is complete, and the last hex that contains an attack dice is the last hex in the chain. You can't change the orientation of the scatter token once you've rolled the attack dice. You can, however, use the dice in any order you like. Once you've made the chain, the card you're using will tell you what to do with it. One last thing before we get to the end phase. Some of your fighters might be wizards, special fighters with access to special attack actions and gambits. If a fighter is a wizard, it'll have this symbol on its card next to a number. That's their wizard level. Gambit spells have this symbol in the corner and work just like ploys, with the exception that you have to cast them to make them work. Each spell has a casting value, which is shown as one or more symbols that correspond to the symbols on the magic dice. When you want to cast a spell, choose one of your wizards on the battlefield and roll a number of dice equal to that wizard's level. If a spell affects a fighter, the wizard that casts it must be able to see the fighter in question. If you roll at least as many corresponding symbols as the spell card shows, it's successfully cast. The critical success symbol can count as any symbol. Don't celebrate too soon though. If you roll 2 or more critical symbols, your wizard takes 1 damage as they become overloaded with power. On the plus side, provided this doesn't slay them, you then get to resolve the spell in the same way you would a ploy. If a wizard died or failed to successfully cast that spell, it just moves to your discard pile. Many wizards can also use spell attack actions. These work just like normal attack actions, except that you use magic dice instead of attack dice, and you'll be looking for a specific magic symbol for success instead of an attack symbol. In most cases, the dice characteristic of the attack action will be a dash, which means you roll a number of dice equal to the wizard's level when you make the attack roll. Oh, also, as with Gambit spells, if you roll 2 or more critical success symbols when your wizard makes a spell attack action, they also take 1 damage from the devastating magical backlash. Again, should they survive, you can continue to resolve the action as normal, almost certainly blasting your opponent to bits. Okay, that's everything for the action phase. Now it's time for the end phase. Just to recap, both players have now taken it in turns to complete 4 activations each, and they've played a power step after each of their activations. Now, they play the end phase, which is pretty simple. Both players perform the following steps in order, starting with the player who had the first activation. Score objectives, discard objective cards, play upgrades, discard power cards, draw cards. I'll talk you through each of these. Score objectives. First, check the objectives in your hand. If you've met the condition on an objective card, you reveal it, collect the number of glory points shown at the bottom of the card, and then put the objective card in its discard pile. Some objectives say that you can score them immediately. These are called surge objective cards. Unlike other objectives, you actually score these during the action phase when the condition is met. Simply reveal them, collect your glory points, and discard the card in the same way. When you score a surge objective, you then draw an objective card so you still have 3 in your hand. Beastgrave also features hybrid objective cards. These have 2 different conditions on them, each of which allow you to score the objective card. Dual objectives, on the other hand, require you to score both conditions on the card. After you've scored your objectives, you can discard any of your remaining objective cards that you don't like. Remember, these are gone for good when you discard them, but you can create space in your hand in the hope of drawing objectives that you're more likely to score. Next up, you can play upgrades from your hand if you have the glory points to do so. This works just like it does in the action phase. Note, you can't play gambits in the end phase, only upgrades. In the same way as objective cards, you can discard any remaining power cards from your hand. You don't have to, this is just an opportunity to free up your hand for better cards. Finally, you draw objective cards until you have 3 in your hand, and power cards until you have 5 in your hand. When both players have done this, you clear any move, charge, and guard tokens from the battlefield, and you're ready for the next round. In a full game of Warhammer Underworlds, you play 2 more rounds in the same way, with the exception that in the third end phase, each player simply scores any objectives as explained earlier. There's no discarding cards, upgrading fighters, or drawing cards. Then the game's over and it's time to see who won. At the end of the game, whichever player has the most glory points, including those they spent on upgrades, is the winner. They win even if all their fighters are out of action. It's all about the glory. If the players are tied for glory, then if only one warband is left standing, that warband's player has won. If both warbands are still standing, then whichever one is holding the most objectives wins. Oh, and one last thing. If a card tells you to break one of the rules I've told you, follow the card. And there you have it. You're all set to conquer Beastgrave for yourself. May eternal glory be yours.